Hello. Welcome to our EDST 401 podcast. My name's Phil.
Callum.
And Curtis.
And we want to thank you for taking the time to sit here and listen to us for the next little bit. Firstly, we would like to acknowledge that we come to this classroom today, or wherever you're listening from, and we have to acknowledge that we are working, learning on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people here at the UBC campus. And we want to be mindful that we've still got a lot to learn regarding these processes, specifically of decolonization. And we want to keep that in mind as we listen to this podcast. So welcome. Today we're going to be talking about critical reflection on neoliberalism in education policy. That sounds very, very dense. So hopefully me and these two PE guys will be able to make it a little lighter for you.
Whoa. Ouch.
We're keeping it loose. So my article that we're going to begin with is talking about the emerging fourth tier in K-12 education, specifically in the finance sector in BC, and how privatization impacts social justice in schools. So the first thing that is important to know is that there's tiers of schools in BC. So tier one are schools that are fully private. They're fully funded by private means. Now, generally this is tuition, but it could also be other sources. Tier 2 schools are funded by a mix of private and public means. So in the article, they refer to these as quasi-private schools. And that means they get money from the government to run their schools, as well as private sectors like tuition or businesses that the schools decide to run, anything like that. In Tier 2, there's a little bit more of a breakdown. They group the schools in Tier 2 into two different groups. Group 1, and the only real distinction between the groups is how much funding they get from the government, to make it easy. And then Tier 3 are schools that are fully public schools. They're funded fully by public means. And then the emerging fourth tier that hopefully we'll be able to talk about are public schools that are engaging in a little bit more private means of getting funding. So there's some really kind of important themes that you should be picking out of this article, and we'll talk about them briefly here. So the first 1 and 2, because they're connected, are going to be schools and social justice, as well as schools and privatization. Because schools kind of become a melting pot of a lot of learning and different learning styles, social justice can really happen. Social justice teaching can really happen in schools. And as we learn about in this article, the privatization of schools and school funding has happened in BC for many, many years. So we can now examine how that has affected schools and social justice in those schools. Another aspect of privatization that we're going to talk about hopefully is the competition among schools about attracting students. So based on the way the province's funding model works, students or schools with more students get more funding. So it then behooves schools to try and have more students, right? And the last couple of points here, we're going to talk about specifically that third tier of schools. So those would be schools that are generally you would think of as public schools, and how that third tier is kind of fragmenting into schools that get money from the government, publicly funded schools, and then those same publicly funded schools that are now kind of operating in a private manner and trying to get funding privately. And then finally, we're also going to talk about hopefully the unequal distribution of market funding amongst schools due to some of that privatization.
Yeah, Phil, so that makes me think about just trying to make a quick connection here to my article, which we'll get into later, but it was on alternative education. And it talked about the East versus West schools and the attraction through their alternative education and how they can pull each other, pull students from different school areas to bring them in via these alternative education tactics. But mine didn't talk about finances at all. So it's interesting to see how the finances can also come into play here with this.
Yeah. So as you said that, there's actually a really interesting rather than cool stat in the reading that says, it's talking about how students kind of have that mobility to choose where they go to school. So if we think about Main Street as a divide between East and West, 35% of students east of Main don't go to their neighborhood school, and 33% of students west of Main don't go to their neighborhood school. So it's fairly comparable that kids in both sections, like I'll say, are exercising that mobility to choose where they go to school. However, the real telling part of the stat is that 13.5% of students east of Maine choose to go to a school west of Maine, where only like 3% of students west of Maine choose to go to a school east of Maine. So there's like a very clear migration east to west.
That's pretty interesting, like having that flexibility and that student choice, because my article, and like I'll say, we'll dive into that later on, it talks about creating this like privatization and like personalized learning where it gives the autonomy to these students to choose, what courses they do, to like, it brings in that choice into their education and making it more personalized, it's kind of interesting to see the correlations between the three.
Yeah, it's crazy how my article just had a brief point, which I found super interesting and makes total sense when we all think about this. But the main reason for students to move schools was due to their friendships, like having friends with other kids at other schools. So it wasn't due to academics. It wasn't due to different bilingual schools or anything like this. It was due to their friends that they had going to different schools. So that's kind of just an interesting little fact as well. Yeah, so I'll take the chance now to jump into my article. It was titled "From Alternative Schools to School Choice in Vancouver School District, 1960s to the Neoliberal Present," and it was by Jason Ilsa and Yi Soo Yoon. So starting from the 1960s, there's two main types of alternative schools. There would have been like a rehabilitation schools. So this is kind of for students who may have been struggling in some way. And then there was district-specific alternatives, such as like religious groups at the time or schooling around those areas. But talking about the rehab schools, I think that's super important. At the time, there was just a main focus on the public education, and they're like the main core group. And then we had these alternative schools that focused on the students who struggling with grades or struggling with home life or anything related to why they could no longer do school in the mainstream system. And with that being said, I think it's important that we take the time to understand that our current system's kind of going away from this in many ways, which I'll talk on later. But to jump into like the next group of it would be like the mid 80s. There was a shift, and the Vancouver School District focused their attention way more towards like academic, and this was kind of the shift to the academic successful students and families. So Vancouver School District allowed choice, like we talked about earlier, and students were able to jump schools within their district as long as they weren't full or anything like that. But there's definitely a lot of choice that students could do in finding a school that suited them. And with all these alternative options that started to come later, such as we're seeing now with IB and French immersion and all this stuff, we were having students starting to use these resources to kind of specialize for their academic journeys for the future, which is what a lot of parents often are thinking about when their students are going through, or not students, when their children are going through high school. Following that, we kind of go into more academic-oriented mini schools. So, for example, the BC Quest program was a wilderness program that focused on outdoors. So this was a kind of another alternative education option. And in going back in a bit, 1976 started an Indigenous youth program where 3 Indigenous teachers taught students about their history, songs, dances, forms of art, and stuff like that. So they called this group the Kumtuks program, and the word means to teach in Chinook language. So I found that was kind of like an interesting little bit.
You said the teachers were Indigenous as well?
Yeah, so they got
so cool.
super cool. They got 3 Indigenous teachers to teach their children about their past history, and you got to do more activities related to, kind of what their upbringing was. But I wanted to connect this kind of to what we're seeing today. We're seeing a lot of schools that are IB or arts programs or academies or immersion school, French immersion school, stuff like that. So we're seeing these types of shifts, and the shift that started, this alternative school idea started in the 60s to help students who were struggling, and now we're seeing these alternative schools in a way that they're giving an advantage to the students who are already doing well in school and looking to go on to the next level and this stuff. So we've gone from like helping the kids who need it,
Like the bottom line, raising the bottom up.
exactly, to now we're just like trying to get the top even better. So I think that's like where we need to start to fix it, which I'll talk about this in a bit, but I have such a good example from my practicum that I was able to do. So yeah.
And I wonder why this shift is happening, and like with this shift of like trying to take, say, like the top 10% of students and trying to have them excel, like what are the implications of that, and like who is allowed to be in that top 10% just because of their extenuating circumstances of, say, their home life, their parents' income, that sort of thing? Or is it because they are just solely like that gifted and they're just trying to push their boundaries? So it's interesting to see like what's causing this. Is it a genuine thing, or is it more so
I'll
like
tell you right now, it's privatization to a degree.
Yeah.
Right? Like the whole thing is money talks.
Yeah,
right?
income is the biggest part of this. If you think about some of these, like, from sports background, some of these sports academies that are happening now that are costing like tens of thousands of dollars a year, it's insane.
Yeah.
It's absolutely insane.
Well, I know my practicum school, I went to a private IB school for my practicum, and tuition for a year, and this is from K to 12, this school is roughly like 10 grand a year, and that's still not some of the most expensive ones. There's some in the North Shore that are 30 grand a year for
St.
K to
George.
12.
St. George's and
St.
far.
George's, yeah.
And they were another little reading part of this week, and I think it said their tuition was like 20 grand a year, something like that.
20 or 30, I think.
Crazy.
Yeah. Crazy.
So
What?
So then it brings the idea of like, okay, well, if you want your kid to be in these specialized programs, like you're gonna have to foot a hefty bill, and it's like, who does that excludes so many people.
That's like the top like 5%.
Yeah,
That's all it pleases.
Which is interesting because that leads into my article. So my article was solely focused on the privatization and having like the private sector and companies starting to infiltrate like educational policies. And its main focus was looking at how there's a correlation between this company Cisco, which was a private technology company. We may have heard of it, Cisco, and how they were influencing the premier, the education in British Columbia, and their main focus was trying to shift the educational model from what it is now to moving towards more of a personalized education driven through technology. So there were 3 articles or 3 documents that they analyzed. It was the Cisco Systems White Paper, and then the BC Premier's Technology Council's Advocacy Paper, and then the BC's Ministry of Education's Education Plan that was launched in 2011. So the paper kind of looked at how these actors, so these 3 different kind of groups of people, were involved in kind of shaping the plan and examining how it conceptualizes the purpose of education, teaching, and learning, and like the roles of how teachers and students kind of operate within the system. And what they were ultimately trying to do was create this personalized education that was driven through technology so that these students would move out of like that general classroom where you're taking like your standard subjects, but going towards picking courses that were more focused on creating like soft skills that would eventually lead into like an occupation down the road, but it was more specialized and focused on what you were interested in rather than kind of doing a broad approach to learning. So the way I like to think of it is treat it more like a sniper bullet than a shotgun shell.
Yeah, depth versus breadth.
Exactly. So it was, and it's very interesting to kind of see, and then moving into like the roles of teachers and students is like students become more of like this consumer where they are picking and choosing based off their interests. And then the teachers are moving away from like an educator and being like the holder of knowledge and bestowing it onto their students, but rather like as a coach or a guide or like a facilitator that are just there to help the students along the way. So obviously the Cisco system or the privatization system is created these really good relationships with the education side of it, because now they're having an influence on the policies that are happening. So the 3 documents, the privatization ones from Cisco came out in 2008. When then the BC Premier's Technology Council advocacy paper was published in 2010, 2 years after, and then the education plan from the Ministry of Education BC came out in 2011, was updated in 2015. So it's, when you read through in this paper, it kind of nitpicks different parts. They're pretty well identical sayings and attributes of it, which shows this private sector is now influencing what was traditionally a public civil kind of operation. So it's very interesting to see the two kind of happen, or how they interact with each other. And it makes me think, like, obviously Cisco wants to move towards this personalized education because they are the ones that are going to reap the benefits. Because if you have to transition all these students from what classrooms are like today to everyone needs, their laptop, these online courses, they're doing it where they want, when they want, to give them that freedom and that accessibility. Like, that is such a multi-billion-dollar transition. And then what it also does by creating this consumer-like model for education, it is putting these students in that consumer mindset. So I was thinking, once they leave their education, they get into their adult stages of life, they're going to be so familiar with this technology and with this company and that familiarity. Like, I have an iPhone, I'll probably always stick with an iPhone because I'm familiar with it. It's creating that consumer, so down the road they're also going to be a consumer of their future products, like for lifelong consumers. So it's very interesting to look at these different aspects of it, of how they're trying to, the privatization of education driven through technology and personalized learning. It was very interesting to see. It kind of touches on how both of your papers were, you have the accessibility to choose your schools and that sort of thing.
Well, double-edged sword, right? I mean, I think everyone would generally agree that choice in your education is probably to the benefit, especially of the student. But I think one of the large takeaways that I'm taking away from the article that I'm focusing on, the emerging fourth tier, is that the privatization piece of it can really be detrimental to let's say the 90% that isn't, your top 10%, right? So choice in your education is great. I mean, we all chose to be part of this program, but making it inaccessible, I shouldn't say that, but if you choose to make it accessible to for a very specific demographic, choosing to make it accessible to a very specific demographic with them in mind, who are you not thinking of?
Yeah,
exactly.
Right? And who's going to suffer?
That's that bottom. That's that bottom tier, right?
Yeah.
I have just a quick example I want to pull from my practicum. Yeah, so they had this program that was called the Graham Y program. Super cool program. It was based around phys ed, but it was guided towards students who were struggling within their school. So either academically struggling with showing up to PE attendance-wise, students who were currently suspended, students who there was a student who was even expelled from the school but was still a part of this program.
Wow.
So he was grade 12, just trying to get his last few credits. To graduate. So they had is afternoon of every single day a teacher would go over there, not my teacher who I was watching, but I just went with them for the day. And they had they went to the Y Center, the rec center across the road, maybe a 5-minute walk from their school. Yeah. So awesome place. The kids had full access to weight room, gym, pool, everything. And within this, they'd have workout plans, do-a-tangs, all this, but they would get their phys ed credit. So they had a grade 12 could get 2 separate classes from this in the afternoon. They get their active health and they get their phys ed.
Nice.
So, and this is for kids who are for this one certain student, if he doesn't have this, he doesn't graduate.
Yeah, it's
does
funny.
he probably come back to school? Probably not.
Yeah.
He's just going to end up going into life without graduating high school. Yeah. So this is one of those alternative educations kind of pools that they're starting to do that I think more schools need to do, because this is the stuff that helps that bottom 10% that we're talking about, which is huge difference in comparison to all these IB and other schools on the top end, right? Yeah. So it's total opposite, but in my opinion, more important.
For sure. And when you when I relayed back to my paper and like how this company is trying to, or this private company is trying to integrate into the public education, they don't explicitly say it in their document or anything, and they would never come out and say it, but it's like, why are you doing this? Who are you catering to for this, this new groundbreaking shift in education? It's like, who are you only keeping in mind when you are implementing this? Who are you excluding? What are the implications? Because it said in the article, like, this is catered towards the middle to upper class.
Totally.
Right? And if you are a struggling family, you don't have that income to support and pay for all of this technology and courses for your student, like, what is the default then if you're making this groundbreaking shift to solely doing this? So it's the implications of it are just not well thought out.
Yeah, I agree. You can really see it. That's what I think the most frustrating part is for me. After I read this emerging fourth tier article, you could really see some of those impacts, right? They were talking about, as an example, talking about international student tuition, which is huge in BC.
Night and day.
Right?
Crazy.
Like nuts. And that brings in so much money. But the article went through and looked at just the raw data of a bunch of different school districts across the province, right? So West Van, as a district, is the district in the whole province that makes the most money from international students' tuition. And it's like not close. They've doubled the next closest district. And it's in the millions of dollars that they're making just from this one revenue stream. Whereas some of the lowest districts, the districts with some of the lowest percentage of that money are like way out in the interior, right? So the one, as an example, Nicola Similkameen. Don't even know what that is. Couldn't even tell you.
Find it on the map.
Yeah, right? Way out there somewhere. But, even like if we think about the populations of those two districts, right?
Yeah.
West Vancouver, very, very affluent, already has money. Nicola, whatever. Their population is
Some respect on the
largely indigenous as well. So now we're even talking about, this goes back to the intersectionality and, all the dialectics that kind of intertwine these political, economic, and social justice roles that schools can play, right? You can see the pitfalls when you really start looking at it. So I think really what we should be taking away from neoliberalism in schools, in education, in the education policy specifically, is that there's going to be pros and cons, and we have to decide which are the most important for us to act on, right? We're getting increased student agency with some of this. That's great. Like, students should be allowed to have some choice, especially in what they want to do.
Totally.
We're making kids make massive decisions at 16 years old anyway, so they should have some of that agency. They should have some of that knowledge. But we also have to remember that it's going to affect every single student, regardless of us designing it for one specific group of students or one demographic. And we have to think about who's being affected the most, and some of those that are being affected that we're not thinking about. So,
sure.
Pros and cons, we got to take away a lot from this.
For sure, and I think, when doing this, like if you are a privatization or a private company coming in, trying to avoid looking at, okay, what's going to be my profit margin on this, and because that's what it seems like is the trend is, okay, how much money can I make off of this transition? There has to be the considerations of all these multi-factors that have major keys into this, so that it is an inclusive system and policy, and it's not driven by corporate greed. But I think
the actual benefit to the student. That's what's got to drive it.
Yeah, it's got to be student-centered. But that's all we have for you today. We appreciate you tuning in, and we'll catch you on the next episode.
We'll see you next week.